Human behavior. Next session. In today's session, we will be talking about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So, as we discussed so far, that human behaviors are the reason of different factors. Some factors are external, some factors are internal. We studied about the biological reasons of behavior as well, that how neurons play part in the behavioral patterns of any human being. Then we also discussed that how sleep disorders can also affect the human behavior. We also discussed about alcoholic man, how the alcohol can bring disruptions in the way a normal person would behave. So, likewise, there are different ways a human behavior can also be recycled. In fact, put it this way, you must have heard about a science which is known as NLP, which is Neurolinguistic Programming. The basic concept of Neurolinguistic Programming is the reconditioning of mind. Our brains are conditioned to respond to situations in a certain manner, and that we learn from our early childhood. So once we grow up, there are certain behaviors we would not like, and we would like to change those behaviors. However, since those behaviors have been learned in the early childhood and those behaviors are totally pushed into our psychology, that it becomes very difficult to get out of that routine. The behavior goes on autopilot. You need not to control yourself to respond in a certain manner, the way you respond in certain situations, because the behavior has actually gone on autopilot. But now, in this circumstance, once you know that there are certain behaviors which are actually creating troubles, now you would want to change those behaviors. And now, first of all, is this a possible thing which comes into your mind as a question, that will you ever be able to do it? Will you ever be able to change the way you behave in certain situations, in certain circumstances? Because you would know that your behavioral pattern is causing trouble. So you would not want yourself to behave or respond in certain manners. So I also recall one of the example of great boxer Muhammad Ali Khaleh. He once discussed during an interview that whenever his inner self drives him for any sin, he pinches himself, or he lights a small flame of fire, and he exposes that flame of fire to his body. And then after having the flame creating the uncomfort, he tells himself that when you cannot bear this small flame of fire, how will you bear that flame of fire in the hell? So that way, Muhammad Ali conditioned himself and conditioned himself to learn a new behavior. This is the exact example which we use. Surprisingly, in both of today's two topics, we can apply the same example in both cases, which is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. In classical conditioning, there are two different behaviors which are being combined to create a response. If we take a look at the bookish definition, then it would go like this: that learning process that occurs when two stimuli are repeatedly paired. Two stimuli are repeatedly paired means two things are combined. Resultingly, there is simple action which is taking place. A response which is at first elicited by the second stimulus is eventually is elicited by the first stimulus alone is known as classical conditioning. Since we are learning about the human behavior, which is the course to learn human behaviors, so in today's session, we are trying to know that how exactly the new behavior, the new responses can be learned. So I found this best example, which I have shared in this slide, which has got four screens within the slide. And if you take a look at that, it has got first one, which is before conditioning. Second one is also before conditioning. Third one is during conditioning. And fourth one is after conditioning. This is one of the finest slide I found to explain this topic of classical conditioning. As the definition says, that if two stimuli are repeatedly paired, that means, for example, if upon a single action there was a kind of a response you as a human were responding with, but now subsequently, if initially before responding in that pattern there that particular action is preceded by one another act. So once now these two stimuli are combined together, there is a response which you will eventually going to take. So now this example might was a little complicated, so you might have found it a little difficult to interpret this example, but I have this, because of this reason, use a simple example. So let's discuss this example which we have on this slide. In the first slide, what we see is a dog is being shown a pan of food. When the dog looks at the pan of food, the response is the saliva, the salivation, which starts taking place as the dog takes a look at that food. Because now the dog knows that the food bowl is now right in front, and eventually the dog is going to have it. So the natural process starts, the process of salivation inside the mouth of the dog. So now we are trying to recondition this behavior of the dog who takes a look at the food, and only then the process of salivation takes place. So in the second response, in the second screen, what we see is a bell. So when the bell rings, so there is no salivation taking place. But when the dog takes a look at the food, then eventually the dog gets to have the salivation taking place. So now, if you just keep this definition of book along, so take this food as first stimuli and the bell as the second stimuli, and now we are trying to combine the two stimuli. So as we discussed that when the two stimuli are combined, a new response is actually created. So what we initially see is that the dog is not having any salivation once he, hears the bell. But whenever he looks at the food, the salivation takes place. Now this new behavioral pattern which the dog is going to have, in the third screen, the dog starts to have conditioning. So now whenever the bell rings, the dog looks at the bell and immediately the food is presented to the dog. Now here, the conditioning of dog's behavior is taking place. So initially when the dog was looking at the bell, there was nothing and the dog was not having any salivation. But in this third scheme, what we see is during conditioning, the dog is being presented with two stimuli at a time. The first the stimuli is the bell. So whenever the bell rings, dog takes a look at the bell side, and right after that, the dog is presented with the food. So now this mechanism is repeated and repeated and repeated multiple times. As you see in the definition, it says learning process that occurs when two stimuli are repeatedly paired. So now we are trying to pair these stimuli so that a new behavioral pattern is taught to a dog, so that every time the dog bell is ringing, so we want the dog to have the same reaction the way the dog gets to have when he looks at the food. So now this these two stimuli are being combined, and these two are being combined for a long period of time, a long period of time. So every time there is a bell which rings and dogs takes a look at the bell, and eventually right after that the food is presented. Now these two stimuli are combined, so now the dog starts getting to have this behavioral pattern learned, that whenever a bell is ringing, right after that food is coming. So whenever there is a bell ringing, right after that, food is coming. So this behavioral pattern is taught to the dog for a repeated long period of time. So now the dog knows eventually, after having long practice done, that whenever there is a bell ringing, there is a combination and there is going to be presentation of food. Now these two stimuli once are combined, so now these two are not two different actions for the dog. Now this becomes a single action for the dog. Now the bell becomes equal to food. Initially, these two were different things. Food was a different thing, and bell was a different thing. Now, as these two stimuli are combined, and bell is so repeatedly rung, and every time the bell was ringing, so there was a food presentation taking place. So now, when these two stimuli are combined for a very, very long period of time, so now the dog is not going to distinguish between these two, and the bell ringing is going to be presentation of food for the dog. So after having the dog gotten conditioned for a very long period of time, and after a very long period of time, now when it was tested that now whenever there is bell ringing, right after that, the action which was taking place was the salivation taking place. So here we learned that dog has now eventually learned a new behavior. In the very first condition, the reason of salivation was only food bowl. In the second one, bell was ringing, but there was no charm for the dog in that. But in the third one, alongside with the bell ringing, there was presentation of food. When once that was repeatedly done, so these two things became equal, and for the dog, ringing of bell became equal to presentation of food, and eventually now, as this is the natural response to the dog, that every time food is coming in front, there is salivation taking place. So now, whenever the bell was ringing, so as the bell ringing also became equal to food presentation in the mind of that dog. So eventually, every time the bell was ringing, the salivation started taking place inside the initially inside the brain of the dog, and then eventually that salivation starts taking place in the mouth. So this is to what we call classical conditioning. Two different stimuli are combined together to basically learn a new behavioral pattern. So this way, human behaviors can be redefined. This way, human behaviors can be learned again. So same way, the way the dog is being taught in this example, new behavioral patterns, same way human beings can also be taught and conditioned with the new behaviors. And This way, once one thing is so repeatedly combined with another, there is always a certain type of response in the mind of that person, and result will be a new behavioral pattern. Initially, as a student, when you take a look at the books, you start getting a little bored that now you'll have to study for a very long time. But now, once this action is combined with presentation of money, for example, you are being taught that if for continuous 1 month you will do the study part, then you will be paid with 10,000 rupees. Then there is new conditional learning taking place. And now you know that if you will study continuously for like 1 month, then at the end of 1 month, there is a reward which is coming your way. And because of that, you will learn this new behavior. So the same example we can actually apply in the coming second part of this lecture, which is of operant conditioning. But in classical conditioning, what we are trying to discuss is that when two stimuli are combined together, there is a new behavioral pattern which eventually you get to have inside your mind. So probably the example which I just shared of the human being alongside with being paid money, this is the best example for operant conditioning. This may not be very specific example for classical conditioning. However, the core idea I hope is clear in your mind now that when two different stimuli are combined, then there is always a reaction which you gets to have, and because of that, you will learn the new way of behavior behavioral response. This example, one example can be now, as I was trying to create one example. So may not be very appropriate example, but we are just trying to understand the new behavioral pattern. For example, initially a kid was shown a slap but was not being hit by the slap. So these were like two different actions. One was showing of hand, and second was slapping. So every time the small kid was slapped, the small kid started crying. But when the hand was shown, it was making a no difference for the kid. So now, when the kid is repeatedly being shown these two things in step, that hand is shown, then there is a slap. So the third action which the kid is going to take place is crying. So once you start doing this thing repeatedly, learning process that occurs when two stimuli are repeatedly paired. Now, once you pair these two things, two acts together, that you show the hand, and after like 5 seconds, you give a slap. You show the hand, after 5 seconds, you give the slap. You show the hand, 5 seconds, and you give the slap. Now the kid is learning a new thing. Initially, the show of hand was not a problem, not a big deal for the kid. But now this was going to become a big deal because showing of hand, the kid was not responding with anything. But slap, the kid was crying. But once this act was repeatedly done, eventually a time came when the fear got inside the brain of that child. Now there was this new behavioral pattern learned by the kid. Now it was not the slap required to the kid, for making him cry, it was only the show of hand, because this was a new pattern now learned, that every time there is a slap shown, then there is a gap of 5 seconds, and there a slap comes. So now the new behavioral pattern which the kid has learned, that if there's going to be a show of hand, then it is going to end up with a slap. So now every time a hand is shown, the kid starts crying, because now the kid has learned that, you see, show of hand means a slap coming after a few times. So this is an example which I just created to explain this concept of classical conditioning. So I hope with this there's little clarity. I hope the absolute clarity is there of classical conditioning. It, these are this classical conditioning is basically behavioral learning and reconditioning of responses. So now we will jump to the second part of today's lecture, which is operant conditioning. So the operant conditioning, let's start this topic with the definition first. So the definition says operant conditioning, also called instrumental conditioning, is a type of associative learning process through which the strength of a behavior is modified by reinforcements or punishment. So let me explain this definition. Operant conditioning is a type of learning in which you teach a behavior by either rewards or punishment. We have written a word here, reinforcement. So the reinforcement means reward basically. So whenever there is a new behavioral pattern you are trying to introduce into a human being, you are going to either present a reward after completing it, or you're going to punish the person if that certain thing, is not done. So through this process of reward and conditioning, there is a new behavioral pattern of forceful learning which eventually takes place. To explain this process of operant conditioning, again there is a simple example we have in front, in which we can see a mouse. Specific consequences are associated with a voluntary behavior. What we can see here is a mouse, and we've got two different screens. One is left side screen, then left side screen is having a split with this white line, and then there's this right hand side screen. So there's this left hand side screen and right hand side screen. In the left hand side screen, what we see is reward introduced to increase a behavior. What we see is on the left hand side, you can see that the mouse is using the top legs. You can actually call it the hands, and it's actually pushing that thing which is alongside with the wall. And every time the mouse pushes that thing, there is a jacket unfolding, and there's this a plate light thing coming in front with the food placed in it. So the mouse has learned in this example that whenever that mouse is pressing that thing which is installed on the wall, so whenever that thing is actually pressed by the mouse, a thing opens up and the food comes in front. So this is a way we are trying to teach a mouse to repeat an act, because now the mouse would know that every time the mouse is going to press that installed thing on the wall, the mouse is going to get the food. So obviously mouse would look for the food, and every time there is this hunger for the food, desire for the food, the mouse is again going to run to the same location of the wall and will press that installed thing again. and after having it pressed, there's the presentation of food taking place. So now the mouse has learned this behavior that whenever the mouse is needing the food, the mouse is required to push that button. You cannot call it a button. They um, push that thing which is there on the wall, and once you push it, the food is actually presented. So in this operant conditioning example, what we see is that the mouse is being taught this new behavior, and the mouse is being invited to do this act again and again, repeatedly. So the first time presentation of food is a big catch, is right away a behavioral learning for the mouse. So it won't take mouse to, do it repeatedly to find out that there is this food coming up. The first time the mouse has done it, so the mouse is obviously going to do it again. So every time now the mouse is going to do it, there is going to be presentation of food. So once the mouse has learned this new behavior, eventually, now we would like to change this behavioral pattern of mouse, because what we have seen is that the mouse starts coming to the same location again and again, and knows that there is this thing the mouse the mouse has to press, and then the food is going to be presented. So to stop mouse from doing it, on the same screen now on the right hand side, you can see another example. And from this example, you can see that this time the same mouse, then the same handle which was there on this, installed on the wall. Now this time when the moment mouse touched that handle to push it for the tray to come in front and present the food. But this time there was a difference in the way things were earlier. So this time when the moment it touched that handle, the mouse felt current inside. First of all, there was a current. And the second thing, alongside with that current, was ringing of the bell. You can see in the example on the right hand side that on the left hand side there is this almost pink colored thing which is turning on. This, you call it bulb. You may call it a bulb. Okay. The bulb is turning on, which is of pink color. And now every time the mouse is going to touch that handle, there is going to be a current. Alongside with this current, there is going to be this light coming up. So now the mouse is learning this new behavior. But earlier, the thing which mouse had learned was the pressing of handle, green light was turning on, and the food was presented. So this was a, a thing which was now retained in the head of the mouse, and this new behavioral pattern was learned by mouse that whenever the handle will be pressed, there will be switching on of green light, and there will be presentation of a tray alongside with food. But in this next screen, now there's this new behavioral pattern in which the mouse is presented with the same situation, but now the responses are different, the feelings are different, the occurrences are different, and mouse this time, every time the mouse is touching the handle, there is this pink light turning on, and mouse feels current in that handle, and the mouse, gets to have a jolt because of that current. So, so since the mouse was already trained for the food by pressing the handle, so obviously the first time mouse gets to have this jolt, this may not be the learning thing right away for the mouse. And the mouse would again like to repeat the act and would like to learn again, would like to check, his luck again, that whether if there is going to be a presentation of food again or not, because for a very long time, the mouse was having an easy access to food by just pressing the handle. But in this example, this time, what's happening with the mouse is that every time the handle is being pushed down, there is this grunt, and because of that grunt, there's feeling of inconvenience and there's a jolt which the mouse was going to have. And now this thing was getting repeated and repeated and repeated, and eventually the mouse will totally forget the last behavior which mouse had learned, that was of pushing of handle and presentation of food. But now, because of this new experience which the mouse gets to have of pressing of handle, and the pressing of handle was connected with a current, electric current. So now, because of this electric current, the mouse will abstain from touching that handle again. Obviously, after a certain period of time, after doing some repeated acts, eventually there's going to be new learning in the brain of mouse, and eventually the mouse will stop doing it. It eventually will stop coming to the wall because now there's no more charm there. Earlier there was the charm of food presentation now, but as the same place, same location is now giving it inconvenience, giving it jolts of current, no food, so obviously the mouse would hate to be there again. So the same way human behaviors can also be reproduced. Human examples, human behavior can also be reconfigured. So now here the example of Muhammad Ali, which we discussed in the beginning, can be rediscussed. That every time Muhammad Ali was being driven towards a sin, he used to light the flame, and he used to bring his hand and give it exposure to that flame. And once the hand was burnt by that flame, Muhammad Ali used to tell himself that if you cannot bear this small flame, then how will you bear the flames of hell? So this way, there was this conditional learning that every time the Muhammad Ali now was having this, sin thoughts in the mind, so that was without having even lighting the flame again, the same feelings was again crossing his mind, and there was this new behavioral learning, which he got eventually got into have. So if you talk from the organization's perspective, yes, in the organizations, the HR department also applies the same process of rewards and punishments. So, in the organizations, after a certain period of time, in addition to the salary, there are additional things given, and performance bonuses are actually given. Those performance bonuses are actually dependent upon, as the name itself suggests, performance. So, whenever there is a performance by the employee, there's going to be presentation of a bonus. So that's a new thing which eventually employee will learn, that now hard work was responded with reward. So likewise, employees, there are different type of employees in the organization. There are certain who obey the law, who obey their seniors and who abide by the law. So once there are going to be resources who are violating the laws, who are not listening to the seniors, there are going to be punishments also presented. That may be in the form of cut of salary, that may be in the form of not cut of salary, not presentation of bonuses, and letters of warning. Employee being told that, you see, if you will get to have these two warning letters on the same mistake, then there is going to be a salary cut of 15 days. So obviously 15 days of salary cut is a big thing for any employer. No employee would want to have that 15 days long salary cut. And because of that, the thing which the employee is going to have is a new behavioral pattern. Now, the employee would know that the employee has to maintain the discipline, because if the discipline will not be maintained, then there are consequences of it. And if the discipline is maintained, and with also good work also being done, then there is an element of reward. That reward was in the form of international tours, that also performance bonuses, sharing of employee name with whole team, sharing of emails with the whole organization, appreciating the employee, presenting the employee as hero of the organization. So all these various things will elevate the motivation of that employee and will force him to perform more. And that obviously is going to be great help for the employee. That obviously is going to be great stimulus, great reason to perform well and not to perform badly, to stick away or stay away from the, you know, from the consequences. Same way, the example which we discussed earlier in that classical conditioning thing, which was hand and a slap. So if we just revise that example, that whenever the kid is doing good thing, whenever the kid is doing appropriate acts, the kid is actually presented with a candy. And every time the kid is not doing a good act, or every time the kid is doing certain act which is wrong, then if the kid is slapped on that, though obviously this is not uh, being appreciated, this is not being taught to do this, because this is just an example which we're sharing, that there are certain parents who would follow this routine, but this is absolutely not being uh, not being sort of persuaded to be taken as a bad behavioral pattern. Rather, kids should be taught with, obviously, with love, darlingly. So, because at the end of the day, they are only kids. But just to understand the concept, so if the kid is being given punishment over a certain thing, then the kid eventually will refrain from doing that act again, because now the kid would know that there is going to be a punishment from the mother or the father. And if the kid is doing good act, then there is going to be praise, there's going to be clap, there are going to be claps, and the kid will feel excited and happy doing the same thing again. So with this we get to know that human behaviors are redefinable. So if we have learned bad habits, so it's a bad thing to have, but will you ever in the world be able to get away from these bad habits? Yes, it's a difficult thing, but it's not impossible. This is a hopeful thing. There is light in the at the end of the tunnel. That if you want to change the way you behave, if you want to change the way you perform your actions, then you can condition your mind to learn new patterns. You can condition your mind to learn new behaviors. Only you need to keep your mind intact. You need to continuously uh, keep training your mind. You do not need to have any other person or any second or third person to give you rewards or punishments to for you to learn a new behavior. Just like in the example of Muhammad Ali, he was doing things to himself. He was doing things to himself, and because of that, he actually learned a new behavior. Same way, that pinching can also be replaced. I mean, that fire exposure of hand to the flame of fire. If anytime you do a good thing, just give yourself a party. Just give yourself a chocolate, buy yourself a chocolate, or buy yourself a coffee. Every time you perform a good act, a massive good act, just give yourself a reward for it. So that way, this reward or punishment thing, you could have the psyche of reward and punishment, which is studied in the field of human behavior. You can apply the same on your own self, and without any external interference, you will yourself be learning new behaviors, new behavioral patterns. And this way, the brain is actually controlled in either positive manner or negative manner. So the hopeful thing is that the brain can always be recycled, brain can always be retrained, so the habits can always be relearned, behaviors can also be changed. So if you get to see a person, or if you get to find yourself indulged into certain acts which you would not want to repeat, so now there's going to be hard effort, but there is a possibility that you can change it. So if you set yourself some good goals, you need to progress in your life, you need to progress in your study. Just give yourself a reward system. Every time you bring good results, every time you meet your target, just give yourself a treat. So that way you will learn yourself that you see that if you will achieve certain goal which you have settled for yourself, then there is a reward coming for yourself. And who is going to give you that reward? It's you yourself. So we are now concluding this talk. Operant conditioning and classical conditioning are the two learning behaviors, the two way new behaviors can be learned. We have discussed today, and we will be coming again. We'll be meeting again in the next session. So until then, Allah Hafiz.